Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the space race, the secrets behind the moon. This is not another victory lap for the 20th century. This is a careful look at what we were told, what was quietly filed away, and what still sits in the shadows. Why does it matter now? Because when governments, industries, and intelligence services move billions of dollars at the speed of innovation, the past isn't just remembered, it's managed. And when history is managed, our understanding of power today gets very fuzzy. Think about the official story you grew up with. The clock starts, the superpowers sprint, and one small step ends the race. It's simple, it's cinematic, it's also incomplete. Tonight, we are going to hold that polished narrative up to the light and ask the questions that polite history tends to skip. Not to be contrarian for sport, but because the record itself begs for scrutiny. Consider the line that frames this entire talk. History is written by those who can declassify it. That is not a snarky slogan. It is a sober reminder that access, not just evidence, shapes truth. If a file stays stamped and sealed, it does not simply disappear. It creates a blank space that later storytellers fill with whatever fits the needs of the moment. Sometimes the fill-in is patriotic myth, sometimes it's bureaucratic convenience, and sometimes it's a silence so loud it makes you wonder what, exactly, was too sensitive to survive public daylight. Now, I'm not here to ask you to believe everything you've heard in late-night interviews or to trust every rumor that echoes down a desert runway. I'm here to insist on something more demanding. Think with me. Follow the trail of what's documented, then notice the edges where documentation suddenly thins. Track the overlap between science and strategy, between exploration and exploitation. Ask yourself, in an era defined by secrecy, how many decisions were made not in lecture halls or press conferences, but in rooms where the cameras were never invited? We will proceed with care. We will separate what was announced from what was done. We will listen when the public story conveniently ends and the paper trail keeps going. I will not tell you what to conclude, but I will ask you to notice patterns. When budgets grow opaque, when oversight shrinks, when grand projects take on a life of their own, does history usually become clearer or harder to verify? When centralized authority holds the purse and the pen, do incentives line up with full transparency or with narrative control? Those are not ideological questions. They're practical ones, and they set the tone for everything that follows. Here is the promise of this lecture. We will honor the achievements. We will also honor the questions. We will keep our feet on solid ground, but we won't be afraid to look toward the places where the ground drops off and the fog begins. If the official tale is complete, it will survive careful examination. If it isn't, the gaps will show themselves. So take a breath, clear your assumptions, and get comfortable with the pause between what we think we know and what the documents actually say. The space race is a thrilling story. It is also a complex ledger of power, prestige, secrecy, and yes, the human tendency to tidy up messy truths. Let's open the file, page 1, and see which parts of the past were built to be seen, and which parts were built to be seen through. Let's begin with the version of events that almost everyone knows, the official story. In the late 1950s, the Cold War wasn't just about nuclear stockpiles or ideological standoffs, it was also about proving which system could quite literally reach higher. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a small, beeping sphere that sent shockwaves across the world. Overnight, space became the new battlefield for prestige, technology, and influence. The Soviet momentum didn't stop there. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, cementing the USSR's early lead and sending American policymakers into a near panic. If the Soviets could put a man in space, what else could they put up there? And perhaps more importantly, what could they drop from orbit? Space achievements weren't just science milestones, they were strategic demonstrations with very real military implications. In response, the United States escalated. NASA, founded only 3 years earlier, became the crown jewel of American ambition. The Gemini missions refined spaceflight techniques. And then came Apollo, the bold, expensive, and publicly celebrated push to land humans on the moon. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin planted the American flag in lunar soil while Michael Collins orbited above. The official narrative says that this moment was not just a victory for the United States, but for humanity itself. And the cost? Officially, the United States poured around $30 billion into the space race by the time the moon landing was achieved. Adjusted for today's value, that's well over $200 billion. The Soviet numbers are harder to pin down, partly because they didn't publish them, but estimates put their spending at several billion over the same period. The stated purpose was simple: scientific advancement, exploration, and peaceful competition. But even in this glossy version of history, there are hints that the real motivations ran deeper. The moon wasn't just a scientific target, it was a high ground in the most literal sense, a position from which any nation could claim both symbolic dominance and potential strategic advantage. So here we have the clean, triumphant storyline, two superpowers, driven by national pride, racing toward the heavens, and ending with a handshake of sorts, the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. A competition that pushed technology forward, inspired generations, and was eventually replaced by cooperation. But does this version account for everything? Does it explain the full scale of the spending? Does it address the quiet overlap between civilian science and military necessity? And perhaps the biggest question, does it tell us what was happening in the shadows while the world was watching the rockets on television? These are the questions that take us beyond the surface, and as we move forward, we'll start to see why the official story, while inspiring, might be only one layer of a far more complicated reality. So why bother poking at the official story? After all, it's clean, it's uplifting, and it's already in the history books. But here's the thing, history isn't just about what happened, it's about how it's told. And the space race was born in an age where secrecy wasn't the exception, it was the rule. The Cold War was a time when both the United States and the Soviet Union guarded their strategic advantages like crown jewels. Billions of dollars moved through budgets that were only partially visible to the public. Entire programs were labeled with vague, harmless-sounding names to mask their true purpose. This wasn't paranoia, it was policy. And when you start with that context, it becomes a lot harder to assume that every dollar in the space program went exactly where we were told. We also know something else. Black budgets, funds not fully disclosed to the public, were a fact of life in this era. In the US, they were used to develop spy satellites, advanced aircraft, and intelligence networks. In the USSR, they funded missile programs, covert space technology, and military infrastructure hidden behind a civilian facade. These weren't small side projects, they were major investments, protected by layers of classification. And then there's the overlap between military research and civilian science. When a rocket can carry a satellite into orbit, it can also carry something else entirely. Guidance systems, propulsion technology, communications infrastructure, all of it could be applied to defense just as easily as exploration. In fact, the dual-use nature of space technology was one of the main reasons governments were willing to spend so much. They weren't just exploring the moon, they were investing in a strategic edge. History gives us plenty of examples where official narratives left out inconvenient details. Entire programs have been declassified decades later, revealing truths that would have changed public understanding at the time. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Manhattan Project, surveillance programs that were denied until evidence made denial impossible. Why would we assume the space race was immune to this pattern? So when we ask, why question it? We're not chasing conspiracy for the sake of drama. We're acknowledging a historical reality. Powerful nations protect sensitive projects, and they often do it by giving the public a simpler, cleaner version of events. This doesn't mean every rumor is true, but it does mean we should treat the official account as a starting point, not the final word. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this: what you see on the launch pad might just be the part they want you to see. The real story could be happening out of sight, up in orbit, deep underground, or buried in a budget line no one thought to question. If we're going to talk about secrecy, we can't just speculate. We need hard, documented examples, cases where what was publicly said and what was actually happening were two very different things. And in the United States during the space race, there is no shortage of them. Let's start with one of the most famous locations in the American imagination, Area 51. Officially, it didn't even exist for decades. When it finally was acknowledged, the explanation was that it was a testing ground for advanced aircraft like the U-2 and later the A-12 Oxcart, the forerunner of the state Route 71 Blackbird. That part is true, but here's what makes it relevant to our topic. These were highly classified programs operating entirely outside public awareness, often hidden under budget categories that looked like something else. And while people were watching rockets take off from Cape Canaveral, other crews were quietly flying experimental craft over Nevada. Craft that generated UFO reports the Air Force had to manage carefully. Then there's the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOL. On paper, this was a joint NASA and Air Force project to test human endurance in space and conduct scientific experiments. In reality, the MOL's true mission was reconnaissance. It was intended to be a manned spy station in orbit, complete with high-resolution cameras aimed at the Earth. For years, this program's real objective was classified. By the time it was cancelled in 1969, much of the technology it developed had already been folded into other, equally secret programs. Speaking of reconnaissance, we have to talk about the Corona and KH series satellites. These were the first successful American spy satellites, capable of taking detailed photographs from orbit and returning the film in reentry capsules. These programs were massive undertakings, involving thousands of people and billions of dollars, yet they were hidden under layers of security. The public didn't know about them until the 1990s, decades after they had fundamentally changed intelligence gathering. What all of these have in common is a pattern. The public face of a program was often different from its classified reality. The budget entries, the public briefings, even the names were chosen to conceal the most important details. And these aren't fringe theories or rumors, they're confirmed facts, backed by declassified documents and official admissions. So when we look at NASA's high-profile missions during the space race, we have to remember that they existed in the same ecosystem as Area 51, the MOL, and the Corona satellites, an ecosystem where secrecy wasn't a side effect, it was the design. And if programs of this scale could operate in total secrecy for years, even decades, what else might have been hidden behind the bright glare of televised rocket launches? If the United States had its shadow programs, the Soviet Union had them too, often on an even larger scale, thanks to the USSR's deeply centralized and opaque system. In the Soviet model, secrecy wasn't just about protecting sensitive projects from foreign eyes, it was baked into the entire culture of governance. That meant enormous military projects could run for years without even the Soviet public knowing they existed. One of the most striking examples was the Almaz program. Officially, the Soviets introduced a series of space stations in the 1970s called Salyut. They were presented to the world as platforms for scientific research and peaceful exploration. What the public didn't know at the time was that some of these stations weren't Salyut at all. They were Almaz military reconnaissance stations. They weren't just watching the Earth. One was even fitted with a rapid-fire space cannon for defense against possible satellite attacks. Imagine the official line, science and cooperation, paired with the reality of an armed outpost in orbit. Then there was the FOBS program, short for Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. On paper, it was never openly discussed. In practice, it was a way to place nuclear warheads into low orbit and orbit them over a target anywhere on the globe. Unlike traditional ICBMs, FOBS could approach from unexpected directions, making them harder to intercept. The Soviet Union tested these systems under the guise of space research, carefully hiding the military nature of the program from the outside world. And we can't forget the N-1 lunar rocket, the USSR's answer to the American Saturn V. It was a massive vehicle designed to carry cosmonauts to the moon. But here's the part that didn't make the official broadcasts. The N-1 failed catastrophically in all four of its test launches, including one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. These failures were kept secret for decades. Soviet citizens never saw footage of the rocket blowing apart on the pad, and the rest of the world didn't learn the full story until long after the Cold War. Just like in the United States, these Soviet examples show a clear pattern: ambitious, expensive, and often militarized space projects operating under a civilian cover story. The difference is that in the USSR, the secrecy was even more total. There was no free press to leak the details, no public budget hearings to probe the numbers, no independent watchdogs to question the purpose. If the government said a launch was for peaceful science, that was the end of the conversation for everyone except the people actually working on the project. So when we line up the American and Soviet approaches, what do we see? Two rivals, each racing for space supremacy, each telling the world one story while pursuing another. It's a reminder that the space race was never purely about exploration, it was about power. And power, especially in the Cold War, thrives in the shadows. Now let's talk about one of the most intriguing overlaps of the entire space race era: the connection between UFO sightings and Cold War aerospace activity. On the surface, these two topics might seem worlds apart. One belongs in the realm of science fiction, the other in the official record of 20th century history. But dig a little deeper, and you find that they were, at times, tangled together in ways that raise important questions. First, we have Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force's official investigation into unidentified flying objects. Between 1952 and 1969, Blue Book logged 12,618 reports. Most were explained as conventional aircraft, weather phenomena, or astronomical objects. But here's the part that's hard to ignore: 701 cases were classified as unexplained. Not probably this or likely that, unexplained. Those cases stayed in the file with no definitive resolution. Now, while UFO enthusiasts often focus on those unknowns, there's another piece of the puzzle that's just as fascinating. Declassified CIA documents reveal that a significant number of UFO reports during the 1950s and 60s actually coincided with high-altitude test flights of spy planes like the U-2 and the A-12. These aircraft flew higher than commercial planes or known military jets at the time, creating bright, reflective streaks in the sky that people couldn't identify. From the CIA's perspective, this was a problem. they didn't want to draw attention to the existence of their surveillance programs, so UFO explanations became a convenient way to deflect public curiosity without revealing classified projects. And then there's Roswell, 1947, predating the space race, but still shaping how the public processed later events. The official explanation, decades later, was that the debris came from Project Mogul, a top-secret program to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloons. Whether you accept that explanation or not, the Roswell case set an enduring precedent. Highly sensitive military technology could be hidden behind the curtain of mysterious sightings until the real story could be safely told, or buried. It's not just about America, either. The Soviet Union had its own surge of UFO reports, some of which later turned out to coincide with missile tests, satellite launches, and classified aircraft. Like the US, they had every incentive to downplay the military connection and let the mystery hang in the air. The point isn't to say that every UFO sighting was just a spy plane or a missile test, far from it. But the documented overlap shows that the UFO phenomenon and the space race were not entirely separate conversations. In some cases, they intersected in a way that benefited the secrecy of both sides. When the public's attention was on strange lights or flying discs, it was often far away from the real hardware being tested. So the next time you look at a UFO sighting from this period, ask yourself, was it a visitor from another world, or was it part of the same Cold War race for dominance in the skies and beyond? And more importantly, who benefited from letting you believe one over the other? Up to now, we've talked about programs that were secret at the time and later revealed. But there's another category we need to look at, projects that were very real, very ambitious, and sounded so far ahead of their time that even today they feel like science fiction. These weren't rumors. These were funded, engineered, and in some cases, physically built and tested. Let's start with NERVA, the nuclear engine for rocket vehicle application. This wasn't a concept sketch, it was a working nuclear thermal rocket program developed by NASA and the Atomic Energy Commission. The idea was simple in theory but bold in practice: use a nuclear reactor to superheat hydrogen and blast it out a rocket nozzle, producing far more thrust efficiency than chemical rockets. They actually built and test-fired these engines in the Nevada desert. If they'd been deployed, they could have drastically cut travel time to Mars or supported permanent outposts on the Moon. But by the early 70s, political pressure, budget cuts, and public discomfort with nuclear technology in space shut the project down. Then there was Project Orion, an even more radical idea. Orion would have been a spaceship propelled by a series of controlled nuclear explosions behind it. Each detonation would push the craft forward with enormous force, allowing for unprecedented acceleration and range. Yes, this was a real US government-backed study, with input from some of the brightest minds in aerospace. The plan was eventually abandoned, not because it wouldn't work, but because treaties banning nuclear weapons in space made it politically toxic. Still, the fact that it was seriously considered tells you how far engineers were willing to go when the budget and the geopolitical motivation aligned. Project Horizon takes us right to the Moon. In 1959, the US Army drafted a detailed plan to establish a military base on the lunar surface by the mid-1960s. It included habitation modules, supply lines, and defensive weaponry. The rationale wasn't about science, it was about strategic advantage. Whoever controlled the Moon could, in theory, control cislunar space. The plan was shelved, but the level of detail in the proposal makes it clear the idea of weaponizing space was not a fringe fantasy, it was on the table. And then there's the Dinosaur X-20 spaceplane. This was a sleek, piloted craft that could launch atop a rocket, maneuver in orbit, and then glide back to Earth like the Space Shuttle years later. Its potential missions included reconnaissance, satellite interception, and even bombing runs from space. The program absorbed hundreds of millions of dollars before being cancelled in 1963, with much of its technology feeding into later military and civilian spaceplane designs. These projects matter for one key reason: they show that the line between the possible and the practical in the space race era was far more blurred than most people realize. These weren't science fiction dreams, they were engineering realities, stopped only by politics, treaties, or shifting priorities. And if programs this ambitious could be openly acknowledged at least within government circles, it's worth asking, what stayed entirely in the black budget, never to be declassified? When you understand that the United States was seriously preparing nuclear-powered rockets, nuclear explosion-driven ships, and armed moon bases, the notion that the space race was purely peaceful starts to sound like a convenient simplification. The record shows they were willing to think far bigger, and far stranger, than the public ever knew. Now we step into the realm where the paper trail gets thin, the testimonies get contested, and the debates never really end. These are the fringe theories. I'm not here to tell you they're true. I'm here to lay them out, to show why they persist, and to remind you that they grow out of the same soil as the proven examples we've already discussed, an era where secrecy was the norm, not the exception. One of the most enduring claims is that both the United States and the Soviet Union may have pursued secret lunar bases well beyond what was publicly announced. Some believe Project Horizon, the US military's shelved plan for a moon base, didn't just disappear, it simply went underground. The theory suggests that certain Apollo missions, or unpublicized launches, may have been used to move equipment and personnel for purposes that never made it into the history books. On the Soviet side, whispers of parallel lunar infrastructure linger, though concrete evidence is lacking. Then there's the infamous reverse engineering narrative, best known through the claims of Bob Lazar, who alleged that he worked at a site known as S for near Area 51, studying propulsion systems from recovered craft of non-human origin. Critics point to inconsistencies in his background, but the idea persists for one reason: it fits neatly into a pattern of advanced aerospace research being conducted under extreme secrecy, with the public only decades later learning about the existence of certain programs. The lost cosmonauts theory is another Cold War mystery. This claim holds that the Soviet Union launched manned space missions before Yuri Gagarin, but that these missions ended in disaster. Supposed audio recordings, alleged eyewitness accounts, and circumstantial evidence have been offered over the years. Mainstream historians dispute the authenticity of this material, but again, the total control of information in the USSR makes the theory difficult to completely dismiss in the minds of some. And perhaps the most dramatic theory is the idea of joint U.S. Soviet cooperation on an off-world threat. This one suggests that behind the scenes, despite the political theater of rivalry, both nations shared certain data, possibly on anomalous objects or phenomena, because the perceived danger was bigger than the Cold War itself. No official confirmation of such cooperation exists, but the concept taps into a broader truth: sometimes enemies collaborate when faced with a shared interest. It's easy to wave all of this away as pure speculation, and maybe some of it is. But here's the interesting part. Each of these theories grows from patterns we can prove. We know about hidden programs. We know about black budgets. We know about technology decades ahead of what the public was told. When that's your baseline, the leap to more sensational possibilities doesn't seem quite as far-fetched to those who study this period. Whether you believe these stories or not, they point to an important takeaway: the space race left behind more than just rockets and footprints. It left behind a culture of curiosity, mistrust, and unanswered questions. And the more you dig, the more you realize that in an age of absolute secrecy, what we call histories might be only one carefully curated version of the past. The Cold War may have ended, but the patterns we've been talking about didn't vanish with the fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, some would argue they've simply evolved, adapting to new technologies, new political climates, and new public expectations. If you've been paying attention in the last 2 decades, you've probably heard of programs like ATEEP, the UAP Task Force, and AARO. ATEEP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ran from 2007 to 2012, at least officially. It had a modest budget on paper, but its focus was anything but small, investigating unidentified aerial phenomena. That's right, the Pentagon openly admits that, for years, it had a formal program dedicated to studying UAPs. The details of what was found remain fuzzy, partly because much of the material is still classified. When news of ATEEP broke in 2017, it reignited public interest in what the government knows, and doesn't tell, about things in the sky. Then came the UAP Task Force, set up to continue and expand on AATIP's work, and more recently, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO. This office is tasked with a broad mandate, investigating not just aerial phenomena, but anything anomalous across multiple domains: air, sea, space, and even things that might not fit neatly into those categories. In its 2024 historical review, AARO stated it found no verified evidence of crash retrieval programs or reverse engineering efforts. For some, that's the final word. For others, it's just the latest official statement in a long line of denials that history warns us not to take at face value. What's striking is how much of this echoes the Cold War era. You have programs that operate quietly until they're acknowledged under public or political pressure. You have carefully crafted language that leaves room for multiple interpretations. And you have a public split between those who accept the official line and those who suspect there's more under the surface. Even the justifications sound familiar. Back then, secrecy was framed as a necessity to protect national security from a rival superpower. power. Today, it's framed as a way to safeguard sensitive sources and methods from adversaries, different players, same reasoning. The budgets are still layered, the access is still restricted, and the public still gets just enough information to know something's going on, without being invited fully into the loop. This isn't about proving that a hidden space fleet exists or that alien technology is locked away in a warehouse. It's about recognizing that the machinery of secrecy is still running, and if it's still running, then the lessons of the space race aren't just history, they're the present. The players have changed, but the game feels eerily familiar. So the question becomes, if decades from now the files are declassified, will we discover that the 21st century was just as full of untold stories as the 20th? And if that's the case, will we be any more prepared to question them than people were back then? At this point, you might be thinking, all right, interesting history lesson, but why should I care now? The answer is simple. Because the patterns we've uncovered here aren't just relics of the past. They're a reminder of how power operates, then and now. The space race is often sold as a story of pure inspiration, of humanity reaching for the stars. And yes, there is truth in that. But when you look closer, you see something else, an enormous machine fueled by secrecy, strategic competition, and budgets so vast they could hide almost anything. That combination is not unique to the 1960s, it's still with us today. Think about what we've already proven. Governments have successfully hidden billion-dollar programs from the public for decades. Entire facilities, fleets of satellites, advanced propulsion systems, all operating under layers of classification. When we see that, it's not a stretch to imagine that their official version of events might be just the surface layer, carefully managed to protect deeper priorities. And when secrecy is combined with centralized control over information, it becomes harder for outsiders, whether that's journalists, researchers, or ordinary citizens, to verify what's real. History has shown us again and again that when oversight is minimal and budgets are opaque, the truth often comes out only when it's politically convenient, if it comes out at all. That's why this matters. It's not about chasing every rumor. It's about cultivating the habit of questioning. It's about recognizing that the story we're told is shaped not just by what happened, but by what's chosen for us to see. And that choice is rarely made in a vacuum. It's influenced by politics, by strategy, and yes, sometimes by the desire to keep the public focused on a clean narrative while the real work happens elsewhere. The scale of hidden history is staggering, and if that's true for an era we now look back on with nostalgia, how much more is possible in our present, when technology moves faster, surveillance is more pervasive, and information can be shaped or buried with a keystroke? When we ask why this matters, we're really asking, what kind of citizens do we want to be? Passive consumers of history, or active participants who question, investigate, and think critically about the stories we're given? The answer will shape not just how we see the past, but how we navigate the present and the future.